The massive wolf drew nearer with each pounding heartbeat, its feral breath slicing through the rain-soaked night. Every second brought it closer, an unstoppable force cutting through the thick forest shadows. We sprinted wildly, lungs burning, feet slipping on the muddy ground. But the relentless thud of its heavy paws echoed like a dark countdown.
We need to run faster, Catherine.
Alex shouted, his voice strained with urgency.
The rogue wolf will cover the distance in a few steps.
My grip on Alex's hand tightened as I kept pace, the mud slipping beneath my feet. The forest around us seemed to come alive, the shadows shifting in the corner of my vision, adding to the growing panic in my chest. "Can't we shift?" I gasped, my voice breathless from the run. "We could fight back, right?" Alex's face twisted into a grimace as he glanced over at me, his sharp blue eyes filled in determination.
No, he's too big. We can't fight him.
If Alex said it, I believed it. He was the future alpha, born to lead, and his instincts were sharper than mine. The way he kept looking over his shoulder, though, it worried me. Alex was stubborn, fierce, and almost never backed down from a challenge, especially when it came to protecting me. I didn't dare look back again, not with Alex so intent on keeping us moving. We were nearly there. The college hostel just barely visible through the sheets of rain, the faint yellow light offering a glimmer of safety. With a final burst of energy, we stumbled through the hostel's doors, slamming them shut and collapsing against them, my clothes drenched, my hair clinging to my skin. The coldness of the rain had seeped deep into me. I glanced up at Alex. He was breathtakingly handsome. His damp brown hair clung to his forehead, soaked and muddy, his sharp jawline slick with rainwater. His blue eyes looked more beautiful. His clothes clung to his muscular build, the fabric outlining every curve of his body, towering over me. His gaze falling over my soaked clothes, clinging to my curves in all the wrong ways, and I could see his expression shift, his eyes darkening. My own cheeks flushed as I realized just how exposed I look. I wrapped my arms around myself instinctively, and before I could say anything, he was close, too close. I could feel his breath soft and unsteady. His hand lifted, brushing a wet strand of hair away from my face, and then he tilted my chin up. I could see the way his jaw tightened as he leaned down, his gaze dropping to my lips. There was something possessive in his eyes, a fierceness that made my heart race all over again. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me against him, and I could feel the heat radiating off him, his strength wrapping around me. I was still catching my breath when he dipped his head, his lips brushing against mine in a way that made me shiver. It was slow at first, gentle, as if he was asking for permission. Then his lips pressed harder, more possessively, and I felt a fierce need ignite within me, a desperation that matched his. His hands tightened around my waist, pulling me flush against him, and I gasped as his tongue slipped into my mouth, deepening the kiss. I pushed against his chest, gasping for air as my head spun. "Alex, wait." Before I could finish, he moved even closer, pinning me against the wall, his body pressing into mine in a way that left no room for anything but him. My pulse quickened, a fire igniting inside me. I could feel his muscles flexing beneath me as he kissed me deeper, his hands sliding down my back, gripping me closer, as if he were trying to pull me into him. Finally, when we pulled back, we were breathless, my hands on his chest as I tried to steady myself. He looked at me, his eyes wild and fierce, his lips swollen from our kiss.
I'll always protect you.
He whispered, his voice thick with desire. I looked up into his eyes, my hand reaching up to brush a stray lock of hair from his face. "I know, Alex, and I'll always be right here, by your side." It was farewell night, the final evening of our college days. I dressed myself for the party. My thoughts drifted back to when things were simpler. Just the three of us, Alex, Eric, and me. Alex always had a quiet strength that set him apart in the Moonvale pack. a natural leader, even during our childhood training in the woods, pretending to be soldiers and strategists. I admired him, but it was during those sessions that I realized just how much I cared for him. Eric, on the other hand, was different. Quiet and reserved, he kept his pain to himself, but his sharp mind and intelligence matched Alex's. He was the strategist, always seeing things before anyone else, reminding us we were more than just warriors. Back then, we were inseparable, bound by pack, bloodlines, and a loyalty deeper than anything. Though Alex and Eric were different in so many ways, both were fiercely protective of me, and I of them. Together, we shared secrets, dreams, and fears, our bond growing stronger with every challenge. Now, as I stared out into the night before the farewell party, I realized how much had changed. But one thing was certain: the past would always be with us. Our bond was unbreakable, no matter what the future held. I stood in front of the mirror, pulling the soft fabric of my red off-shoulder gown into place. The gown flowed like liquid around me, hugging my delicate curves just right. My hair, I'd left mostly loose, cascading down to my waist, with a thin braid tucked on the side. I tucked a loose strand behind my ear. My sea-green eyes sparkled with a playful glint. I tilted my head, smiling at my reflection, almost shy. "How can you be so beautiful, Kath?" I muttered to myself with a grin, not quite believing the girl staring back at me. The thought of seeing Alex tonight made my stomach flutter, even if it was just a farewell party. It had been so long since we'd all gathered like this, and the evening felt like the start of something new. But as I made my way to the party, excitement racing through me, it wasn't Alex who noticed me first.
Wow, you look amazing, Kath.
Eric's voice from behind made me turn, startled. I'd almost forgotten he'd be here tonight, too. I turned to see him standing there, dressed in a dark blazer and matching pants, his broad shoulders and toned physique making him look effortlessly elegant. There was something striking about him tonight. Eric looked deadly handsome, like he belonged on some magazine cover. For a moment, I was speechless, surprised by the intense gaze he held as he looked me over. He grinned when he caught my stare.
Seriously, Kath, you look breathtaking.
"Eric," I smiled, feeling a little bashful under his gaze. "Look at you. I hardly recognize you out of training gear." He chuckled, stepping closer.
Had to make an effort tonight, didn't I?
We glanced around, scanning the room for Alex, but he was nowhere in sight. Part of me grew a little anxious, waiting for him, but Eric's easy smile and light conversation kept me grounded.
Where's Alex?
Eric asked, his voice edged with concern. I just shrugged, glancing around. We waited, the minutes stretching longer than they should have. When Alex still didn't show, Eric held out his hand, his voice a soft, familiar invitation.
Would you dance with me?
A tiny hesitation flickered in my chest, but I nodded, smiling. Of course. As we swayed to the music, Eric and I fell into an effortless rhythm, moving together as naturally as breathing. I found myself laughing at his subtle jokes, his quiet remarks about the people around us. There was warmth and comfort in being with him, a reminder of all those years we'd spent as friends, as allies in training. And yet tonight there was something else there too, something I couldn't quite place, a spark I couldn't ignore. Just as I was starting to relax, I felt an intense, almost piercing gaze on me. I turned my head, and there he was. Alex was standing near the entrance, his eyes fixed on us. He was dressed in his usual dark attire, sharp and polished, with an edge of wildness that always made him stand out. But tonight, his gaze was darker, his jaw tight as he watched Eric and me. My heart skipped a beat, both thrilled and anxious at the sight of him. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the possessive look in his eyes that I'd come to know well. The moment our eyes met, he strode toward us, his expression a mix of anger and something deeper, something almost primal. He grabbed my arm, his grip firm, and pulled me aside, away from the dance floor. Eric stood there, his gaze falling between Alex and me, trying to make sense of what was going on.
What was that?
Alex demanded, his voice barely above a whisper but filled with intensity. His eyes searched mine, a storm of emotions swirling within them.
Dancing with Eric like that? What were you trying to do?
I stared back at him, taken aback by his reaction. Alex, calm down, he's our friend. We were just dancing, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But the fire in his eyes didn't dim. If anything, it only grew.
Just our friend?
He muttered, a bitter edge to his words.
I know what I saw, Kath. There was something between you two. I could see it.
I pulled my arm free, feeling a mixture of anger and hurt rise in me. You're being ridiculous, Alex. You can't just expect me to ignore Eric. He has been by our side since we were kids. He's family.
Family doesn't look at you the way he does.
He replied, his voice laced with possessiveness. Alex, you're the one I love, I said softly, reaching out for his hand. But he took a step back, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Before I could say another word, a voice broke the silence.
Alex, wait.
Eric stepped forward, his gaze steady as he looked between us, his face drawn with a mixture of concern and regret. Alex froze, his shoulders tense and slowly turned around, his eyes a dark storm.
What, Eric?
Eric's gaze was calm but serious.
Why are you two fighting over this? Over me?
Alex swallowed, his fists clenched at his sides.
I didn't like seeing you two like that, Eric.
Eric looked down, shaking his head with a small smile.
We've been friends forever, Alex. I'd never come between you two. You need to trust that, all right?
He placed a reassuring hand on Alex's shoulder.
Kath's yours, Alex. I would never take her from you.
Alex's face softened, a hint of relief flickering in his eyes. He looked between Eric and me, the tension finally loosening in his stance.
I'm sorry.
He said quietly, his gaze finally meeting mine.
I don't want to lose you.
You won't, I whispered, a soft smile crossing my lips as I reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. Eric gave us a nod, a small smile touching his lips.
All right, well, now that we've settled this, I'm going to get myself a drink. You two, take your time.
He chuckled softly and walked away, leaving Alex and me standing there in the quiet, the weight of our emotions lingering between us. Alex looked at me, his eyes softer now, filled with something deep and unspoken. I forced a smile, though my mind kept drifting back to what he'd just done. I cared for him. But this possessiveness, this urge to control who I was close to, left me feeling trapped, as if he didn't trust me. Since that day, Eric kept his distance. He only spoke when he had to, never more. Alex and Eric had been best friends for years, and Eric didn't want to risk losing either of us. But with him pulling away, it felt like I'd already lost my friend. After the final exams, we returned to Moonvale. It felt like a homecoming. The whole pack had gathered to greet us, their smiles wide, their eyes gleaming with pride. It was the first time all three of us, Alex, Eric, and I, stood together as official warriors, ready to serve and protect. But just as quickly as the joy spread, so did the whispers. Rumors of a massive rogue wolf attacking nearby towns seemed to weave through the crowd like smoke. We exchanged worried glances, each of us sensing the weight of the threat. There was something unnatural about it, something that didn't fit the patterns of a normal wolf attack. Later, we gathered in the pack's meeting hall, where Alex's father, Alpha Darius, stood at the head of the room. His voice was low and serious as he addressed us. Our fathers, both powerful figures in the pack. My father, Commander Aiden, and Eric's father, Commander Noah, stood beside him. They looked tense. Just then, Alpha Darius's voice broke through the murmurs.
We need a team to investigate. I'm calling on 3 capable warriors to step up and take this on. Alex, Eric, and Catherine.
He continued, his gaze steady as he looked at each of us in turn. After the meeting, we walked in silence toward the woods, tension thick between us. Alex was first to break it. A cursed wolf. I've read about them, but never thought one would be here. Not in Moonvale. I crossed my arms, shivering. Could it be punishment? Someone who messed with dark magic? Eric shook his head. Maybe, but if it's true, brute force won't be enough. We need a strategy. Alex's jaw clenched. Then we find its weakness. Every curse has one. I nodded, recalling old tales. The weakness is usually personal, a memory, a place, something it's tied to. Eric sighed, his gaze sharp. Then we'll watch it, figure out what it's drawn to. We need to be prepared, train hard and make our weapons before we go in. After the meeting, we walked in silence toward the woods, tension thick between us. Alex was first to break it.
A cursed wolf. I've read about them, but never thought one would be here. Not in Moonvale.
I crossed my arms, shivering. Could it be punishment? Someone who messed with dark magic? Eric shook his head.
Maybe. But if it's true, brute force won't be enough. We need a strategy.
Alex's jaw clenched.
Then we find its weakness. Every curse has one.
I nodded, recalling old tales. The weakness is usually personal, a memory, a place, something it's tied to. Eric sighed, his gaze sharp.
Then we'll watch it, guys. Figure out what it's drawn to. We need to be prepared, train hard, and make our weapons before we go in. We will start from tomorrow.
Alex nodded, but I could see the frustration flickering in his eyes. He'd never been one for patience, and this mission would require just that, a careful strategy, not his usual rush-in and attack approach. The past days had been grueling. Each night, the townspeople grew more frightened, and whispers of the rogue wolf's attacks reached every corner of the village. Children's faces grew pale, farmers guarded their livestock with weary eyes. I could see the anxiety settling in, tightening like a vice around us all. Eric and Alex were as tense as I'd ever seen them. They'd spent every moment by my side, training and planning. I'd crafted a crossbow with my own hands, each detail carefully honed, my mind focused. I was ready, I told myself again and again, but Eric had insisted.
Kath, we need more time.
I disagreed. Deep down, I felt we were as prepared as we'd ever be. When night fell, and the distant, haunting howl pierced through the silence, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. So, in the stillness, I slipped out, crossbow in hand, into the dark, dense forest, hoping to find the creature before it struck again. Then, in the silence, I heard it. A low growl, deep and steady, close enough to feel in my chest. My breath caught as I turned to see him, the massive, shadowed figure of the wolf just feet away, eyes glowing in the moonlight. Before I could raise my crossbow, he lunged. I stumbled back, my weapon slipping from my hands as the beast pinned me to the ground. His weight pressed down, and for a moment, I felt panic rise, thinking this was it. My heart raced, and I turned my head into the earth, too terrified to move. His claws dug into the ground near my shoulder, the pressure strong enough to keep me in place. My heart pounded wildly as I lay there, helpless beneath its gaze, waiting for the attack. The beast clawed at my clothes, leaving them torn and ragged, barely covering me. The beast's claws tightened around my shoulders, pressing me down with a strength that left me breathless. His massive hand tilted my face up, and I felt the sharp graze of a claw tracing a thin line across my cheek, a faint sting blossoming beneath the pressure. I had no choice but to meet his gaze, trapped under the weight of his piercing eyes. But just then, his demeanor shifted, his gaze softening as if he was confused. The beast brought its head closer, and I closed my eyes, bracing myself. But to my shock, it didn't bite or claw. It simply paused, almost as if it was studying me. Its golden brown eyes, which moments ago were wild and fierce, held a strange tenderness, an understanding that took my breath away. I could feel his breath, hot against my skin, and as I opened my eyes, I caught the wolf's gaze, soft, searching. I held my breath, my heart pounding, unable to move. Its large, rough tongue brushed my cheek, then almost tenderly across my jawline, like it was trying to understand me. Then, with a strange, almost careful gesture, he nudged his nose along my cheekbone down to my chin. His gaze lingered on my lips for a while. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps. I was trembling, but something in his touch, in the way his fierce eyes held mine, felt oddly familiar, as if he weren't a beast at all, but someone I'd known once, someone who was both stranger and something else. Before I could fully process what was happening, the wolf pulled back, its gaze steady. In that moment, as it looked at me with a gentleness I never expected, my eyelids grew heavy, my body too exhausted to keep up with the adrenaline that had filled me. My head spun, and the edges of my vision blurred. With one last look into those softened eyes, the world faded and I slipped into unconsciousness. Soft, rhythmic tapping on my cheek pulled me back from the haze of sleep. I blinked, disoriented, trying to remember where I was. Then I felt the cold morning air against my skin and the rough earth beneath me. I was in the woods, where I had foolishly ventured alone last night.
Catherine,
A deep voice called gently, the sound wrapping around me in a strange mix of warmth and frustration. I opened my eyes and turned around to see Eric, kneeling over me, his gaze both worried and stormy. As I stirred, I realized my legs were drawn up to my chest. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Eric glance at me, just a brief look. That's when I realized, with a shock of embarrassment, that I was barely covered. I instinctively wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly feeling so vulnerable. I saw Eric unbuttoning his shirt, his fingers moving quickly and a bit nervously, draping them carefully around me. He kept his eyes averted, careful not to look at me, yet his hand was firm and steady as he fastened the shirt over my shoulders. When he finally looked at me, his eyes met mine briefly, and I caught a glimpse of his bare shoulders and chest, his broad frame well built, and I couldn't help but admire the strength in him.
get up, Kath. We're leaving. Now.
He muttered, a hardness to his tone that I hadn't heard before. I tried to stand, but my legs wobbled under me, the pain from the night before still sharp and fresh. I winced, my hands clutching at his shirt that now draped over me. Eric's brows frowned, a mixture of fierceness and frustration, and before I knew it, his arms were beneath me, lifting me up, strong and steady, holding me close against his chest as he headed toward the fortress. I felt safe in his grasp after the horrible night, though my mind was a whirl of conflicting emotions. As we made our way through the woods, my thoughts drifted to the night before, to the beast, the deadly rogue. Unable to comprehend why the wolf spared me, there had been a strange, unsettling intimacy between us. I couldn't shake the memory of his eyes, fierce and dark, yet vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected.
Trying to play the hero, were you?
Eric finally spoke, his voice laced with anger. His gaze stayed straight ahead, but I could feel the heat of his frustration.
I told you to wait. Max told you to wait.
I winced at the sharpness in his tone, but it was the truth. Both Alex and Eric had warned me, and yet I had gone ahead with my plan. I had thought I could handle it. I am sorry, Eric, I just wanted to—
Say whatever you wanted to say to Alex.
Eric interrupted. I could sense the hesitation beneath the surface, a hesitation that had lingered between us since the argument at the farewell party.
You have no idea what this could cost you.
He said, his voice thick with concern. As we reached the entrance, a familiar figure appeared, Alex. His dark hair was tousled, his blue eyes sharp, and as he saw us, his gaze landed on Eric's bare shoulder, then on the shirt wrapped around my body. The look in his eyes shifted, a flash of jealousy, maybe even anger, darkening his expression. But he didn't say anything. Eric didn't hesitate. His voice was firm, almost challenging as he spoke.
You need to take care of your love.
He said, looking directly at Alex.
She's hurt.
As he laid me on the bed, his gaze dropped to the small cut on my skin, lingering there as if he could somehow absorb the hurt himself. I saw the flicker of pain in his eyes, a quiet, unspoken worry that softened his expression.
She tried to take on the beast alone.
He muttered to Alex, his tone filled with restrained frustration.
And all she had was a crossbow.
Alex's eyes met mine, a mix of anger and concern softening his face.
Kath, you shouldn't have done that alone. We're not ready yet. We're still preparing for a fight like this. You could have been seriously hurt. You were lucky this time.
I could feel a small wave of guilt hit me. But in that moment, a call echoed through the fortress halls, a deep and urgent tone that filled the room. It was the call of the elder, summoning us all to the meeting hall. Alex turned back to me.
Let me clean this.
He murmured, pulling a cloth and a small vial from his bag, his hands gentle as he worked. I could feel the warmth of his touch against my skin, each careful movement revealing more of his concern for me, more of the feelings he kept hidden behind that fierce, collected exterior. Eric stood there with an unreadable expression, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Finally, when Alex was done, he gave me a soft smile, and together we all made our way toward the meeting hall. The meeting hall was filled with the soft glow of lanterns, casting a warm light across the room where the entire pack had gathered. I could feel the weight of every gaze on me, and the excitement in the air was almost overwhelming. Alex's father, Alpha Darius, stood at the head of the hall. Mai and Eric's father stood beside him with head tilted high and a proud smile on their face as they made the announcement.
We have gathered here to announce the arranged engagement of Alex and Catherine, celebrating it as a union that will strengthen the pack.
Darius' voice rang out, steady and strong, his eyes softening as he looked at Alex, then me. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, and my cheeks flushed as I glanced at Alex beside me, his face glowing with happiness. Before I could catch my breath, I felt a familiar voice behind me. Eric's.
I'm so happy for both of you.
He said, his voice sincere. He was beaming, his dark eyes filled with warmth. Thank you, Eric. I managed a smile, grateful to have him there. We'd grown up together, the three of us, and in that moment, it felt like things had come full circle. Alex pulled both of us into a hug, his laughter light.
Eric, you have to stay by our side for the rest of our lives. You know that, right?
Eric chuckled, his arm resting around Alex's shoulder.
I wouldn't dream of being anywhere else.
We all held on to each other for a moment, and for the first time that night, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The night moved in a blur of well-wishes and smiles, and before long, it was time for the engagement ceremony. On the night of the engagement, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, fastening the last pin in my hair, when a gentle knock came at the door. I opened it to find Eric standing there, his face softening as he took in the sight of me in my dress. His eyes swept over me for a brief moment.
Hey, Kath, you look beautiful.
His words lacing with appreciation. I cleared my throat, trying to focus. Thanks, Eric, I said, giving a soft smile. He grinned, though there was a gentleness in his smile.
Come on,
He said.
they're all waiting for the bride-to-be downstairs.
As we stepped into the hall, I couldn't help but feel a surge of warmth at the sight before me. Friends, family, and familiar faces, all gathered to celebrate this night, this moment that was supposed to be the beginning of a new life with Alex. But as Alex slipped the ring onto my finger, sealing our engagement, I felt a pang of something deep inside me, a reminder of that night in the woods, of the rogue wolf's dark gaze, the way his expression changed after recognizing me. I blinked, forcing myself to focus on the moment, on Alex's warm smile as he gazed at me with such pride. Eric stood by our side, clapping and smiling, his expression genuinely happy for us. After the engagement ceremony, I felt like I was floating, still caught up in the whirlwind of promises and whispered words that had bound Alex and me together in front of our pack. The joy on everyone's faces, the blessings from the elders, even the quiet congratulations from Eric, all of it still echoed in my mind. But here, in this quiet room, it was just us, and I could feel the intensity in Alex's eyes as he walked in, closing the door gently behind him. He crossed the room quickly, his gaze filled with a mixture of happiness and longing. Without a word, he pulled me into his arms, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was both tender and full of promise. I melted into him and poured all my happiness into it. Alex's hands moved with gentle confidence, tracing along my shoulders and down my arms, his fingers brushing over my skin as he eased the fabric from my shoulders. His gaze was steady and intense. There was a quiet passion in his touch, which I felt all the way to my core. Drawing me close, he guided my hands to rest gently in front of me, his touch firm yet tender. Slowly, he leaned in, pressing soft kisses along my shoulders, his lips brushing against the curve of my neck. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, a quiet passion in the way he held me.
Tell me, Catherine, who do you belong to?
He murmured, his voice rough with longing. You, Alex, I whispered back, my words a breathless promise that made his hold on me tighten, as if he couldn't bear to let go. His fingers threaded gently through my hair, bringing me closer still, each of his touches filled with a mix of possessiveness and care. Our breaths mingled, our hearts beat in sync, and for a while, there was nothing else. Only the two of us, lost in each other. As I lay beside Alex, watching him sleep peacefully, my mind drifted back to the beast. I watched the gentle rise and fall of Alex's chest, yet I couldn't shake the question haunting me. Why had the beast spared me? A distant howl shattered my thoughts. It was the same haunting sound I'd heard before, the deep, mournful cry of the beast. The sound echoed through the woods, tugging at something deep inside me, stirring a restless ache. I needed answers. Carefully, so as not to wake him, I slipped out of the bed and silently made my way toward the door. The cool night air wrapped around me as I stepped outside, my feet barely making a sound on the forest floor. The woods were quiet, shrouded in darkness, and the moonlight barely filtered through the thick canopy above. My heart raced as I moved deeper into the woods, drawn toward the sound, unsure of what I would find. The forest felt alive, its shadows stretching long and foreboding. There in the clearing I stopped cold. My lips parted, my eyes widening at the sight before me. Eric stood in the center of the forest, his body trembling with pain, his face twisted in agony. He was in the midst of an agonizing transformation. His muscles rippled under his skin, but it wasn't the usual graceful, controlled strength he possessed. No, this was something darker, something twisted. His face was contorted in agony as his body began to change, his form shifting violently, the transformation too painful to watch. "Eric?" I whispered, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and concern. He looked at me, his eyes wild with desperation. As I took a step forward, he staggered, his body spasming in pain, and with a hoarse voice, he warned me.
Kath, get out of here.
He growled, his voice strained.
It might end badly. It took everything I had to stop myself from hurting you that night. Please, go.
My heart sank as I watched him struggle, his skin tearing and reforming, his body shifting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. His words hit me like a blow. He was in so much pain I couldn't ignore. "What's happening to you, Rick?" I asked, stepping closer despite the fear gnawing at me. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and with shaking hands he reached out, his claws now fully extended and glowing faintly under the moonlight. He cupped my face, his eyes filled with raw emotion.
Please, Kath, go. Run away from me. I'm a monster. I don't want to hurt you.
The claws were sharp, too sharp. The moment his hand touched my cheek, I felt a sudden sting, and a sharp pain ran across my skin. I gasped. Regret and frustration flickered in his eyes, and when he saw the pain he'd caused me, he froze for a moment.
See? I've already started to hurt you. Leave now. Just go.
Eric's voice cracked. The words hit me harder than anything I had ever felt. My heart ached for him, for the torment he was enduring, for the pain of his transformation that he couldn't control. Looking into his eyes, I couldn't bring myself to run. I stood there, frozen in my sorrow, as his form continued to twist, becoming more monstrous with each passing second. "Eric, I'm not leaving you," I whispered, but before I could take another step, he shouted at me.
Leave now.
His voice was filled with such anguish that it tore through me, my heart breaking with each syllable. I turned and ran, my legs weak beneath me. The fear I had tried to deny came rushing back, the terror of not knowing what would happen next, of leaving someone I cared about to face a monster alone. But even as I ran, the thought of him stayed with me. I couldn't shake the image of Eric, the man I had trusted, the friend who had always been there for me, now trapped in a nightmare of his own making. What had happened to him? What was this curse, and how could I help him? I didn't know the answers, but I had to find one for Eric, for our pack, and for all of those who loves him. As dawn's first light seeped through the fortress windows, I lay beside Alex, feeling the warmth of his presence. It should have comforted me, anchored me, but my mind was elsewhere. My heart was still racing from the night's encounter with Eric. The pain in his eyes, the tortured sound of his voice as he tried to push me away for my own safety. I hadn't told Alex about it. How could I explain the secret I now held, a truth that wasn't mine to reveal? I felt torn between two loyalties, the one to my mate and the one to my oldest friend who was slowly being consumed by something dark and terrifying. The night was still vivid in my mind. Eric, in the throes of transformation, had barely managed to hold himself back. He'd told me to run, his voice strangled with pain and fear. And now, as the fortress began to stir with morning activity, I knew I had to see him. I had to understand what had brought him to this curse that turned him into something monstrous. When I reached Eric's cabin, he was sitting on the edge of his bed, shoulders slumped, his face drawn and pale. Dark circles hung under his eyes, and he looked as though he'd fought battles all night, battles no one else could see. He looked up at me, guilt etched into his features.
I am that monster, Kath, the one everyone's been searching for.
His voice was barely a whisper, like admitting it aloud might make it real all over again.
I'm ashamed. I terrorize the very people I swore to protect, my pack, everyone. I'm a danger to everyone, even to you.
His words hung in the air, heavy and raw. It was hard to process, the weight of his confession settling on my chest like a stone. My mind flashed back to that night when Alex and I had been chased through the woods. My throat went dry as it dawned on me. That beast was Eric. When did it start, Rick? I managed, my voice shaky.
It was always there, Kath. In the beginning, it was just a small thing, something I could control, push down. But it grew. Stronger, darker, with every passing year.
He said, voice cracking.
That night, during college, the one where you and Alex barely escaped, I was the one who chased you. I can't even recognize familiar faces when I'm in my monster form. I end up chasing my own friends.
Eric's voice caught and he looked away, almost like he was trying to hide the shame and sadness in his eyes. I stepped forward, drawn by a need to ease his pain, to share even a fraction of his burden. Without thinking, I wrapped my arms around him. He sat there stiffly, making no move to return the embrace. There was a hesitance in his eyes, a guardedness I knew well, the shadow of Alex's presence, his dominance over our friendship. Rick, we'll find a way. I won't let you go through this alone, I said, my voice steady. I could feel his breathing even out, feel the tension ease just a little. I have a plan. He looked up, eyes searching mine, both wary and hopeful.
A plan?
Yes, I said, drawing back to meet his gaze fully. Each night, I'll take you into the forest. We'll find a place where you can't hurt anyone, where I can cage and chain you in safety until this curse passes, or until we can find a way to break it. But we'll do it together, Rick. You won't have to face this alone, okay? He closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek.
If it keeps you safe, and everyone else, I'll do it.
He said in a low tone. A long silence stretched between us, the weight of our pact settling around us like a binding promise. The whole day, Eric and I worked in a quiet determination, gathering chains and cuffs heavy enough to bind him through the night. We both knew what awaited us. As the sun was about to slip toward the horizon, we stepped into the woods knowing he'd soon be bound to the forest ground. It hurt me in ways I couldn't put into words. Eric taking one last, steady breath before helping me secure the chains around him.
Make it tight, Kath.
He said, his voice strained.
When it starts, I don't know if I'll be able to. I don't want to hurt you.
I nodded, saying nothing as I tightened each cuff, ensuring each lock was solid. I could see the resignation in his face, the pain of letting himself be bound like this, knowing I would be his witness through it all. As the moon rose, the transformation began. Eric's body shuddered, a low growl slipping from his throat as his bones twisted and reshaped. His eyes met mine, glowing with something primal and unfamiliar, and I felt my heart pound, my instinct screaming at me to run. But I held my ground, ducking behind a nearby tree, not wanting him to see my fear. With a final gut-wrenching roar, Eric was fully transformed. The beast within him emerged, powerful, unrestrained, its golden brown eyes flashing in the dim light as it took in its surroundings. He tugged and thrashed against the chains, his claws raking against the metal, trying to free himself. My hands were trembling as I pressed myself against the tree, torn between running as he'd told me to or staying. If he broke free, it would be chaos. The pack, the village, everything was at risk. I remembered the look in his eyes the night he almost let himself be gentle with me, even in his monstrous form. And so, against every instinct screaming in me to flee, I stepped out into the open. His gaze snapped to me, and for a split second he went still as if recognizing something familiar, something he wanted to protect. I moved closer, cautiously, my eyes locked with his. "It's me, Rick," I whispered, hoping the sound of my voice would somehow reach him. For a moment he didn't move, his glowing eyes fixed on me as if he were trying to decide whether to lash out or to listen. Then, slowly, he stopped fighting the chains. His breathing was ragged, but the fury in his eyes seemed to die down just a little. I took another step forward, then another until I was standing in front of him. His body was still a terrifying sight, massive, covered in fur, with claws that could tear through anything. His eyes locked into mine, his claw grazing my shoulder, tearing the fabric of my clothes but leaving my skin untouched. It was almost as if he was testing his own restraint, keeping his monstrous strength in check for me. I could feel the heat of his breath as he leaned in, his muzzle brushing against my skin. The sensation was strange, almost comforting, as if somewhere in the depths of this form, Eric was still there. He leaned in closer, and I felt the roughness of his fur against my cheek. His muzzle pressed to my collarbone, warm and gentle, and I felt his breath trail over me as he nuzzled my skin. It was oddly tender, his touch filled with a kind of careful reverence that sent a shiver down my spine. I gasped to the strange intimacy settling between us. My heartbeat was loud in my ears as I felt him surrender to this connection between us, to something only the two of us seemed to understand in that moment. As dawn began to edge into the sky, his form grew smaller, the muscles shifting beneath his skin as he transformed back. Exhausted, he slumped against the chains, his face softening back into Eric's familiar human features. I rushed to his side as he lay there, battered and bare, bruises covering his arms from his desperate struggle against the chains. Quickly, I pulled my muffler from around my neck and wrapped it around him, shielding him from the morning chill. He shivered, his eyes fluttering open to meet mine, and I could see the shame lingering in his gaze.
Kath?
He began, his voice rough with exhaustion, but I pressed a finger to his lips, silencing him. "Don't," I whispered, the weight of the night still pressing down on us. "We got through it together. That's all that matters." For a moment, His eyes softened, the haunted expression giving way to something like relief. I held his gaze, feeling the intensity of the night fade as the first light of day crept into the woods around us. I helped Eric through the dense forest, his steps heavy and uneven, as if the weight of last night's struggle was dragging him down. Every movement was a reminder of the monster he fought so hard to keep buried inside.
I'm fine, Kath.
Eric muttered, though his voice was strained.
I don't need your help.
I didn't argue. We both knew that was a lie. So I kept close, guiding him toward the fortress. We reached his cabin, laying him bed gently. I knelt beside him, pulling a cloth from my bag and a small vial of healing oil. "Stay still," I said, my voice gentle but firm as I began to clean the deep gash across his side. The wound was still raw from the previous night, a reminder of the chaos he couldn't fully control. I didn't ask him about the details. As I wiped away the blood, Eric's gaze lingered on me for a long time.
Did I do something wrong to you, Kath? Did I hurt you?
His voice was low, almost a whisper, but I heard the concern in it. It made my chest tighten. I paused, looking up at him. The question surprised me, even though I knew why he asked it. He had already seen the torn fabric of my cloth, a reminder of the unsettling intimacy he had shared with me. His eyes filled with a mix of confusion and guilt, and I could tell he was genuinely concerned. A wave of warmth washed over me, despite the cold. "No," I said softly, offering him a reassuring smile. "You didn't do anything wrong." And somewhere it was the truth. He didn't hurt me. Somewhere deep inside, even in his monstrous form, he seemed to know me, respond to me. I didn't want to make him feel worse than he already did, but I could tell he was not satisfied with my answer. He sat quietly, lost in thought, his gaze distant as he tried to piece together the fragments of last night. After a while, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper.
Can I see your shoulder?
He wanted to reassure himself that he hadn't left any bruises. Gently, I slipped the fabric from my shoulder, and he leaned in, studying it with a quiet intensity. When he saw there were no marks, a flicker of relief softened his face, but his eyes were haunted, his mind racing with the weight of what he might have done. Did you recognize me last night?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper as the memory of our last encounter flooded back, his transformation, the violence, and the way my heart had raced as I fought to keep him contained. Eric's face tightened.
No.
He said slowly, his voice distant.
I don't remember clearly, Kath. It's like a blur. A haze.
"I understand," I murmured. "I know." The quiet between us stretched on, thick and heavy, as I finished cleaning the wound. His gaze never faltered. It was as if every moment he spent with me, he was trying to figure me out, understand what he did yesterday. I applied the healing oil to the wound, my fingers brushing lightly against his skin. I couldn't help the small shiver that ran through me at the contact, but I pretended not to notice. I didn't want him to see how much his presence affected me.
Thank you, Kath.
He said quietly, his voice rough. There was something in his tone, something vulnerable that I hadn't heard before. I looked up at him, and I saw a flicker guilt. "You don't have to thank me," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm here to help, that's all." Each night had fallen into a strange, haunting rhythm. I'd meet Eric by the woods, where he'd let me bind him in thick chains to keep him from hurting anyone. When his transformation began, I'd step back and watch him struggle, his body contorting in the moonlight. I knew the risk, knew he wasn't fully himself, and yet I stepped forward anyway. After so many days, I have learned to control him. Each time, my heart pounded as I reached for him, bracing for what always followed. The passion, the desire, the affection. He'd reach for me with those clawed hands, careful yet fierce, tearing the fabric of my attire. The feeling of his rough muzzle against my skin was strange, almost gentle. He'd lick my shoulder, my collarbone, and something deep within me would shudder. not with fear, but something far more confusing. Each night I left with the remnants of torn clothes and memories I could barely make sense of. I never told him what happened while he was under the curse. Somewhere between taming him and watching his nightly struggle, I began to fall for the man hidden beneath, and I felt a strange pull between us, growing stronger with each encounter, and I was losing the battle within myself. Despite everything, the pain, the danger, even my engagement to Alex, I couldn't stop it. I found myself caught between duty and desire, torn in ways I hadn't thought possible. Yet each time I forced myself to pull away, whispering that it was too dangerous, that following this feeling would destroy us all. Alex had always known me better than anyone. Even now, when I tried to keep my distance, to stay guarded, he noticed every slight change, every time my attention drifted. And lately, it was happening far too often.
Is something wrong, Catherine?
He'd ask, searching my face with those steady, clear eyes of his. But I always brushed it off, forcing a smile, saying it was just due to tiredness. I knew he wanted to believe me, but each time I felt his gaze linger longer, his patience starting to fray. One night, as I was chaining Eric in the woods, he looked at me with a calmness that almost seemed resigned. He took a deep breath, and I could sense he'd been holding on to something.
Kath,
He began quietly, his voice steady but laced with weariness.
we can't keep this from him anymore. Alex deserves to know about the curse, about what I am. He's been your friend, our friend, for too long for us to keep hiding this.
I felt my chest tighten at his words. Part of me had dreaded this moment, but the other part of me knew he was right. The secret, the nights spent trying to tame Eric's monstrous form, the darkness that bound us. It was all too much to carry alone. And Alex, with his endless loyalty and warmth, had a right to know. The next morning after the chaos has ended, Eric and I made our way to Alex's cabin. The walk was quiet, each step echoing the silent promise we had made to each other. As we reached his door, Eric's hand brushed mine, a small, unspoken reassurance that we were in this together. Alex opened the door with a surprised smile that faded as he looked between us.
Kath? Rick? What's going on?
We stepped inside, and I felt a heaviness settle over me as I met Alex's gaze. I wanted to find the right words, but nothing could soften the truth. "Alex," I started, my voice trembling slightly, "there's something we haven't told you, something about Eric." I looked over at Eric, who gave a small nod, encouraging me to continue. "Eric's cursed. Every night he transforms into something dangerous, something he can't control. I've been helping him, trying to keep him from hurting anyone or himself." Alex's eyes went wide, and he looked at Eric, struggling to take it in. For a moment, I thought he might step back, put distance between them, but instead he walked closer, his gaze steady and calm.
Eric,
He said quietly,
you've always stood by my side. And if you're fighting something this dark, then I'll stand by yours. We'll find a way to break it. Together.
The relief I felt was overwhelming, and I saw the same in Eric's face. Alex's loyalty was unwavering, his belief in us unshaken.
So,
Alex continued, a hint of determination sparking in his eyes.
how do we end this curse?
"I have heard about a witch. She might be our last chance, maybe our only chance. I'll visit her today," I said, glancing between the two of them. Eric's face was unreadable, his dark eyes guarded as always, while Alex just gave a solemn nod. The trust in his eyes gave me strength. Eric only held my gaze for a moment before he nodded too. There was an intensity in his eyes that I couldn't quite read, something almost longing. But before I could let myself dwell on it, I left. The witch's hut was deep in the forest, surrounded by ancient oaks that loomed over me like silent, watchful guardians. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and damp moss, and a shiver ran through me as I pushed open the door, stepping inside. She was there, waiting. Small and bent with age, her hair a wild halo of silver, eyes that seemed to see right through me. She gave me a small smile, as if she'd been expecting me.
"You're here for the curse."
She said without preamble, her voice raspy but somehow melodic. I nodded, feeling my heart pound faster. Yes, for Eric, I managed, though my voice wavered a bit. She gestured for me to sit, and I did, unable to shake the feeling that she already knew everything.
"The curse can be broken,
She said, her gaze sharpening.
but it requires a powerful charm, an amulet, and it can only be used by the true mate, the woman Eric loves."
The words hit me like a punch to the chest. The woman he loves? I repeated, struggling to process it. The witch nodded, her gaze piercing.
"The one he loves is the only one who can tame him. She's the only one who can bring him back from the darkness. That is why every time you come close, he yields. It's not the chains that hold him, it's you."
Her words wrapped around me, filling the air with a new, startling clarity. All those times Eric had lost control, all those nights when I'd been the one to calm him down, it wasn't just coincidence. He hadn't been surrendering to the chains. He'd been surrendering to me. But Eric had never said anything, not a word. He'd kept his feelings buried, hidden under layers of silence and restraint. And I had buried my own, thinking they were one-sided. "What do I have to do?" I asked. The witch reached for an amulet on the table. A small, delicate piece of silver, etched with intricate symbols that seemed to pulse with their own faint glow. She held it out to me and murmured an incantation, her voice low and mesmerizing. The air around us felt charged, almost electric, as if the amulet itself was alive.
"When he transforms, he has to break free from the chains. Then, and only then, can you use this,"
she said, her gaze steady.
"The woman he loves must take control. Touch him gently, with affection and love, which he had been craving for, and the time he completely surrenders, slide this amulet into one of his hands. It will bind his heart to yours, taming the curse within him."
I nodded, my heart racing. It was simple in theory, but the risk was terrifying. What if it didn't work? What if Eric couldn't break free, or I couldn't bring myself to? But I pushed the doubts away. I had to believe in this. I had to believe in him. As the witch handed me the amulet, I felt its cool weight settle into my palm, a strange warmth radiating from it. "Thank you," I whispered, gripping it tightly. She watched me, her expression softening.
"This curse has taken so much from both of you,"
she murmured, almost to herself.
"but love has a way of healing even the deepest wounds."
On the way back, I turned the witch's words over in my mind. Eric had never spoken of love, never hinted at anything beyond the loyalty we shared with Alex. But looking back, there had been moments, small, quiet moments, where his eyes would linger on me. His touch would feel just a little too warm, a little too familiar. Had I been too blind to see it, or too afraid? By the time I reached the house, my mind was spinning. As I hurried to Eric's cabin, the weight of the amulet in my pocket felt heavier with every step. The cabin loomed in front of me, just barely visible through the dusk, and I braced myself for what lay ahead. But as I opened the door, the scene that greeted me was nothing I could have prepared for. Alex was standing there, gripping Eric by the collar. His face was twisted with fury, his usual calm shattering into anger.
So you loved Kath, didn't you?
He demanded, his voice shaking with something deeper than rage. Eric's expression was a mix of frustration and resignation. His jaw tightened, but he didn't look away.
"Yes, I did,"
he said evenly.
"I have the right to love anyone. But I told you, Alex, I would never take her from you. She's yours."
A thick silence filled the cabin, only broken by the sound of my uneven breaths as I watched them, frozen. My eyes drifted to a small, worn diary on the table, the pages spilling out like secrets waiting to be uncovered. But before I could make sense of it, Alex's gaze shifted to me. His expression was raw, a storm of emotions colliding.
Why did you lie to me, Catherine?
He demanded, his grip tightening around my arm. His words were a whisper, but they cut through the air like a shout. I didn't, Alex, I managed, feeling the sting of tears in my eyes. I swear I didn't. Eric stepped forward, his voice tense but calm as he gently pushed Alex's hand off me.
Why are you taking your anger out on her? Stop this, Alex.
His eyes softened as he looked at me, and I saw a pain there that matched my own.
She doesn't love me. She's always loved you. She was only helping me with the curse. That's all.
The tension in the room was so thick it felt like a physical force, pressing down on the three of us. I forced myself to take a deep breath, to steady my racing heart. We were all hurting, all tangled up in this mess, but now wasn't the time to tear each other apart. Listen, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but it got their attention. They both looked at me, their anger momentarily softening. We have to find a way to lift this curse. Fighting isn't going to help. We need each other if we're going to get through this. They both nodded slowly, the weight of my words sinking in. Eric let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his dark hair, his expression weary. Alex's grip on my arm loosened, his fingers lingering just a moment longer before he let go, his gaze dropping to the floor. I went to see the witch, I continued, watching their reactions carefully. She gave me this. I pulled the amulet from my pocket, holding it up so they could see. It glinted faintly in the dim light, the intricate silver markings catching their attention.
What does it do?
Alex asked, his voice still strained but softer now. It's part of the ritual to break the curse, I explained. The witch told me that when Eric transforms tonight, he'll need to break free from his chains. Then I have to place this amulet in his hand. She said it can only be done by the one he loves. Eric's eyes met mine, his expression vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before.
Kath,
He began, his voice breaking slightly.
I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted you to be involved like this.
I know, I whispered, swallowing the lump in my throat. But we don't have a choice. There was a pause, each of us taking in the weight of what lay ahead.
I have a condition.
Alex's voice cut through the silence, steady and unyielding.
I'll let you perform this ritual, but only if you promise to marry me the very next day after Eric is freed from the curse.
I looked up at Alex, heart pounding as the weight of his condition settled over me. What a demand he'd made, tying his love to this impossible choice. But I had no choice. So, with a steady breath, I whispered, I promise. Eric stood between us, his face a painful mix of anger and betrayal, though he stayed silent. Just then, Alex pulled me close, his lips brushing against mine right in front of Eric. I couldn't return his kiss, though. My gaze kept drifting to Eric, whose eyes caught mine for a brief, heart-wrenching moment, full of something that looked like longing. And then he looked away, his shoulders tense as he turned and walked off without a word. The ritual was set for tonight. I couldn't shake the nervous thrill in my veins as I prepared. I knew tonight would be dangerous, but I had to put an end to it. I was gathering my things when my eyes fell on a small, worn diary tucked under a pillow on Eric's bed. I'd seen it before but had never dared to open it. Something in me, though, felt drawn to it now, and before I could stop myself, I flipped it open. The words on the page made my heart pound as I read Eric's familiar handwriting.
I've loved Kath since we were kids, but the curse, the one that turns me into that creature, I could never confess it. Alex, my closest friend, loves her too, and now they're together. I won't come between them. I can't bear to lose either of them. Alex deserves her more. He's the future alpha, and he could give her everything I never could. As long as I play my part right, Kath will never sense the truth.
My breath caught, and I had to blink back the emotions surging up in me. I never imagined that Eric, silent, strong Eric who always seemed so composed, had loved me in secret all this time. And he had buried that love so deeply, keeping it hidden not just because of Alex, but because he saw himself as something dangerous, cursed. His handwriting continued, full of unspoken heartache.
Today they fought over me. I can't stand the thought of hurting either of them. Alex and Kath care about each other. Alex has always been the better choice, and I won't ruin that. So I'll keep my distance.
I bit my lip, remembering that fight. Alex had always been fiercely protective, almost possessive at times. But Eric, he'd never acted on his feelings, never tried to draw me to him. And that only made my heart ache more. Then, on the next page, his words grew darker.
When I transform, everything spins out of control. It's like I'm a passenger, barely aware of what I'm doing. I thought I saw someone in the woods last night. I lunged before I realized what was happening, pinned her to the ground, raging, until I looked into her eyes.
My fingers trembled. I knew exactly when he was talking about. That night in the woods, I'd felt the full force of his strength as he'd held me down. But then, just as suddenly, he had stopped. At the time, I thought it was pure chance. But now I knew it was something more.
The beast in me surrendered when I saw her.
Eric had written.
It was Kath. I didn't realize until morning. She was barely dressed with torn clothes and a cut on her cheek. I'm ashamed for hurting her. I keep telling myself I'll stay away, but every time I see her, the urge grows stronger. I don't know how to stop.
My hands gripped the diary tightly as I read on.
Every morning, I see the torn fabric of her clothes, the reminder of my lack of control. It's as if, during the transformation, I'm driven by a craving for her that I can't control, no matter how hard I try. It's like I'm losing myself to her, even against my will. I want to keep her safe, but I don't know if I can stay away.
As I closed the diary, my heart still racing from the secrets I'd uncovered, a presence at the door caught my eye. Eric stood there, his hands folded tightly, almost like he was holding himself back. His gaze met mine, and in those eyes I saw everything. Pain, longing, and that quiet love he'd kept hidden all this time. "Eric," I whispered, but my voice faltered. He just looked at me, his face unreadable, and for a moment it felt like the air around us had thickened, pressing in on us, making it hard to breathe. I took a step closer, the words tumbling out before I could even think. "I love you, Eric," I said, my voice trembling, raw and vulnerable. For a heartbeat, he didn't move, as if he hadn't heard me. But then I saw the change, a glimmer of hope that softened the hard lines of his face, and then the unmistakable shine of tears. One slipped down his cheek, and he let out a shaky breath, his shoulders relaxing as if he'd been holding on to this pain for far too long.
I have always loved you, Kath. Since the beginning. I thought
He whispered back, his voice thick with emotion.
I could keep it hidden, that you'd never know.
His hand reached up, hesitating just a second before brushing my cheek. That touch, so soft and careful, sent a spark through me that I couldn't ignore. Without thinking, I closed the distance between us, pressing him back against the door. My hands found his chest, steadying myself as I rose on my toes, my lips meeting his. The kiss was deep, full of the years of silence and suppressed longing we both felt. It was like the world had stopped around us, and all that existed was this moment, just me and him. Nothing else. Eric's arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and I felt the warmth of his body pressed against mine. His hands trailed up, brushing along my neck, then tracing a slow, possessive path down to my chest. His touch felt like it was branding me, as if he were making up for all the times he'd held back, for all the times he'd denied himself this moment. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathless, he leaned his forehead against mine. His eyes searched mine, and I could see the sadness settled into his eyes.
It's too late, Kath.
His voice breaking slightly, his eyes searching mine as if looking for a future he couldn't have.
Promise me you'll be happy with Alex, that you'll find peace with him.
I felt a pang in my chest, the weight of the curse and our circumstances settling over us. With a shaky breath, I nodded, though the pain in my eyes must have been plain. "I'll try," I managed, my voice catching. He brushed a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His touch was so gentle, so tender, that it made my heart ache even more. For a moment we just stood there, holding on to each other, letting the silence say everything words couldn't. But as I looked into his eyes, I knew I'd never forget this moment. The moon hung low in the clearing as Alex and I helped Eric secure himself with thick iron chains. The chains looked monstrous, cold, heavy, barely able to contain what he was about to become. Eric glanced at me, his eyes soft and full of a sadness I hadn't seen before. I couldn't look back. I didn't want him to see the fear I couldn't hide. Once the last chain was in place, Alex and I ducked behind a nearby tree, our breaths shallow as we watched the ritual begin. Eric's face twisted in pain as his clothes tore, his body contorting, growing larger, muscles stretching under his skin until he was unrecognizable. The creature that took his place was powerful, wild, barely restrained by the iron chains. His eyes glowed, but somewhere in that fierce gaze I still saw Eric, lost, struggling, desperate. Alex leaned close to me, his voice a low whisper.
I think Rick needs our help.
I nodded, though I felt a pang in my chest. I knew Alex loved me too, and despite the jealousy that lingered between them, he couldn't turn his back on Eric. The beast inside Eric growled, pulling against the restraints, the chains groaning under the pressure. We reached the chains and I fumbled with the lock, feeling Alex's gaze flick between me and Eric. Just before I unlatched the last shackle, I turned to Alex, whispering, "Hide. Let me talk to him first." He hesitated, his jaw clenched, but he slipped into the shadows, his eyes lingering on me with a strange mix of worry and something else I couldn't quite read. With a deep breath, I unlatched the final chain. Eric burst free. Eric, or the beast he'd become, stood up slowly, towering over me. His wild eyes settled on me, gleaming with a strange, unfamiliar hunger. His eyes locked onto mine, filled with a raw, unfiltered longing. He moved closer, and I could barely breathe as he gently laid me on the ground beneath him, the cold grass damp against my back. His hands, still clawed and rough, tore through the fabric of my dress with a tenderness that seemed impossible for the beast he had become. His claws brushed against my skin, trailing over my lips, down my cheek, across my collarbone. Each touch was delicate, like he was trying to remember me, to memorize this moment. I wrapped my arms around him, brushing my fingers through the thick fur that covered his chest, letting myself be as close as I could. I knew this was my last chance to be with him, to show him everything I'd kept inside. My hand moved to his face, my nose nuzzling gently against his, and for a moment we breathed together, our hearts in sync. He lowered his head, resting it against my chest, his breathing ragged, his weight comforting and warm. I could feel the slow beat of his heart through his chest, heavy with every ounce of emotion he'd held back. And then, when he was finally calm, I took the amulet I'd been holding and slipped it into his hand. His grip tightened around it instinctively, and a strange light began to shine from his body as he started to shift. Bit by bit, the fur receded, his body shrinking, his features softening. When he finally stilled, he was human again. His body pressed against mine, our fingers entwined. My eyes were closed, but I felt him shift slightly. When I opened my eyes, Eric was above me, his gaze tender and full of awe. We were both crying, tears spilling freely. He lowered his head, pressing a gentle kiss to my forehead, his fingers trailing through my hair.
Thank you, Kath.
He whispered, his voice breaking. He didn't move from where he was, our bodies still close, still warm. I didn't want this moment to end, but I felt a presence beside us. Alex had returned. His face held rage that drew both of us apart. Eric pushed himself up, and Alex offered him his shirt, wrapping it around his skin. Eric pulled him into a hug, his hand gripping Alex's shoulder firmly.
I'm really happy for you, my friend.
Alex said softly, his voice steady, though I saw the sadness in his eyes. I looked down, not wanting to see the pain they both tried to hide. Eric turned to me, his eyes full of emotion, but a small, sad smile on his face.
Promise me you'll take care of Alex. And yourself too.
He said gently, brushing a tear from my cheek. I couldn't speak. I could only nod, my heart shattering with every second that passed. Eric turned to Alex, his voice quiet but edged with raw pain.
I told you, Kath is yours.
The words lingered, weighted with a sorrow even Alex could feel. For a moment, Alex's pride flickered into something softer, something almost like regret. He gave a brief nod, forcing a warm smile in return, but his chest tightened as he saw the tears gathering in Eric's eyes. Eric managed a small, trembling smile before he turned away, each step deliberate, heavy. As I saw Eric walking away from us, my chest ached, and before I knew it, I ran forward, calling out after him, "Don't leave me, Rick," my voice breaking. But before I could take more than a step, a strong arm wrapped firmly around my chest, holding me back. I struggled against Alex's grip, trying to break free, but he was too strong, his hold unyielding.
Catherine, we're getting married tomorrow.
His hold tightening around me, his voice laced with anger and fury, the tension unmistakable after what he'd just witnessed. Tears blurred my vision as I watched Eric disappear into the shadows, taking with him a piece of me I'd never get back. I slumped against Alex, unable to hold back my grief, my pain spilling over in uncontrollable sobs. Alex held me, his silence heavy, as I cried for the man who'd walked away and the love that would forever remain just out of reach.